So this session is a continuation of discussions and case study presentations from cities that have been implementing bus electrification. And just last month, we focused on contracting and procurement. Today, we will hear from ITDP speakers presenting case studies from Jakarta, Indonesia, and cities in India on scale-up strategies and programs. This session stemmed from a recently released report from Santiago to Shenzhen, which is a collection of actions and studies cities can take to electrify their bus fleets. So before we dive into the formal presentations, let me introduce today's panel. I first welcome Stanford Turner, who is a transport manager at ITDP Global. Stan is the main author of the From Santiago to Shenzhen report. He will start the formal presentations and also moderate today's discussion. Next, we'll hear from Vaishali Singh, a deputy manager for ITDP India's Transport Systems and Electric Mobility Program. She'll talk about the rollout of electric buses in several Indian cities. And our third speaker, Faela Sufa, is ITDP Southeast Asia Director, who will talk about the roadmap for Jakarta's MicroTrans electrification, which is part of the overarching integration scheme of paratransit with the Jaklingko public transport system. So with that, I invite Stan to kick us off with the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Ivona, for the wonderful introductions. As you mentioned, this is part two of the series that ITDP is putting together on e-buses, and I believe, as you mentioned, part one can be found on ITDP's events page, along with presentations from our Cycling Cities campaign and Mobilize events and others. So please check that out if you're interested. I think it's well worth kind of revisiting if you have the opportunity. So, apologies. And you can all see my screen, I hope. Perfect. Okay, so as Ivona mentioned, this is actually framed around the research paper From Santiago to Shenzhen, which was developed by the ITDP Global Research and Impact team and the co-author, Mackenzie Allen, who I'd like to also acknowledge. And this is examining the state of knowledge on bus and battery electric buses and the existing opportunities and considerations and best practices, and identifying the current policy and implementation gaps in terms of making that happen. The paper itself tackles various themes, which we will get into, but it really is focused on helping cities in the decision-making process, and especially as they implement electric buses into their existing fleet. So today we will actually cover the existing technology, charging and pilots, operations, financing and funding, and lastly, the supporting strategies. The presenters from India and Indonesia will be diving deeper into the region-specific frameworks around the pilot policies and operations. So before we discuss the specifics around e-buses, I think it's important to highlight the broader context in which bus electrification is part of a larger strategy to address climate change. This infographic is actually from our Compact Cities Electrified report, which was done in partnership with UC Davis, and models 4 scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions and their impacts. As you can see of the scenarios, there's business as usual, which follows our current trajectory and with no changes. The second scenario is high electric vehicle deployment with aggressive electrification of public and private vehicle fleets. The third scenario is a high shift, which policies that really build on compact cities and are focused on walking, cycling, and public transportation instead of cars. And then that fourth scenario, which is a combination of both the high shift and the high electric vehicle deployment, and that it combines both aspects in order to kind of really, again, highlight the need for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's clear that one strategy will not help us attain our climate goals, and the synergies between high shift in terms of modal shifts, as well as high shifting in terms of electric vehicle adoption, really is the most feasible solution for reducing the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So zooming in, let's examine the specifics of electric buses and their impacts. From an environmental aspect, the potential scale of emissions on mitigating with electrification is actually immense compared to that business as usual, this scenario which you saw on the previous slide, and particularly where the electric grids are powered by renewable sources. But over a 12-year lifespan, using electric buses can, or instead of diesel buses, can save almost 1,600 or 1,700 tons of carbon and 10 tons of nitrogen oxide in operational emissions. And these numbers vary widely kind of based on the local electricity generation and climate context, but I think it's really important in highlighting the focus needed for renewable energy sources in terms of powering your grids. In regards to health and safety, by removing diesel buses or ICE buses, cities can also help reduce their diesel exhaust emissions and particulate pollution, as well as ground level ozone. The electrification of bus fleets can really potentially help prevent these environmentally exacerbated respiratory illnesses such as asthma in children and adults. In terms of equity, people who are marginalized often have greater exposure to air pollution, and they bear the negatives and social health impacts that accompany these exposures. So replacing diesel with electric can really reduce local noise pollution and really improve air quality. And it also helps, I guess, that poor communities who often experience higher rates of traffic injuries and emission-related illnesses can be prioritized actually in the safety and adoption of this technology in terms of producing cleaner technologies for the buses, focusing on routes to kind of really help address these disparities as they, again, particularly affect poorer communities and marginalized communities. And then the last piece is efficiency. Energy savings with battery electric buses are the most efficient transfer of energy into motion for electric motors, as opposed to combustion engines, which typically lose a greater amount of energy. This can really also translate into financial efficiencies and operations between battery electric buses and diesel buses. And the transition to battery electric buses can reduce maintenance and fuel costs. So I think all of these factors are just really important to kind of keep in mind as you think about implementing battery electric buses into your cities. We'll take a deeper dive into the technologies, which I think most people are aware of, but I think it's helpful to kind of provide a high-level overview of the different bus manufacturers involved. Some of the most popular vehicles are being made by companies like BYD, New Flyer, Volvo, Yutong, Proterra, and numerous others. And they come in a multitude of different models and lengths, and that can be anywhere between 9 meters and 19. The passenger capacity can be anywhere between 29 people to 135 people per bus. And the advertised ranges, which is a little bit tricky right now, state that they can run from anywhere from 185 kilometers to 529 kilometers, depending on the battery size. In terms of the characteristics of the batteries themselves, the average lifespan is somewhere between 6 and 12 years. And there's several considerations around batteries that cities should note when they are making the decisions around this implementation. And that is weight, size, safety, charging speeds, range capacity, extreme temperatures, self-discharge, and the most important aspect, cost. In terms of different charging technologies, there's a variety. There's a plug-in, there's en route, which is also known as opportunity charging. There's slow and fast, there's pantograph, and there's wireless. So these are just, again, some of the high-level things that cities need to be thinking about in terms of that implementation process. But I just want to kind of set the stage and provide a framework for our presenters as they kind of go into the specifics within their own regions. The last piece I want to cover, though, is the supporting strategies. As the previous slide on Compact Cities Electrified highlighted, the importance of electrification is clear. Part of that long-term planning should involve the following strategies. It's the promotion and policy that encourages zero-emission technology adoption. It's focusing on traffic reduction, greening the grid. So this is the using of the renewable energies and cleaner sources for powering your powering your grid. You should be combining battery electric bus planning with land use planning, and along with the improvements around road. And then that last piece, which I think is really also important, is that integration of bus service with other modes to kind of create a long-term sustainable transportation network. So all of these things can really help, again, improve the quality of bus service, as well as really helping kind of mitigate those GHG emissions, which is something we need to be focusing on in the coming years. All of this information can be found in our report. And if you're interested in seeing the complete report, you can find it on ITDP's publications page. We are currently translating the full report into Portuguese, and that we can expect that to be released fairly soon from the ITDP Brazil office. But in addition, we have developed an executive summary of the report that provides an overview of the findings, as well as key recommendations. And that's available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, which I believe was just released. And additionally, if you are interested in that compact cities scenario, electrified report, that's also available on the ITDP page, publications page, and is available in both English and Spanish. So with that, and I really want to kind of dive into the specifics of this, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague in India, Vishali, who will be providing more insights on bus electrification and the specifics of the scenarios in India. So thank you.
Thanks, Stan. And thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar today. So here through my presentation, I'll try to just, explain what the experience of e-bus transition has been in Indian cities and how they have been able to spark that move towards electrification. What has been the story so far? What kind of pilots has happened and what kind of learnings are coming up from these kind of pilots? Yeah. So just setting the, context itself of what is happening with buses in general in India itself. So a lot of Indian cities, especially the urban areas, do not have formal city bus services. And even the bigger cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Chennai, and many other who actually have city buses don't have enough buses required for the population. So the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, the national ministry here in India, which looks towards planning of urban planning in Indian cities, has actually set a benchmark of 600 buses per million population. And as you can see in the graph, none of the Indian cities, except for maybe Bangalore, comes even close to achieving that benchmark, showing the lack of buses in most of the Indian cities. And the buses which are there, a large majority of them are actually diesel buses, which are being operated by Indian cities, with only a few cities like Delhi, Pune, Ahmedabad actually introducing CNG buses to reduce the emissions as well. And although India did adopt BS6 emission norms, which are equivalent to Euro 4 emission norms a while back, but the transition towards those emission norms have been quite slow because of the bad financial health of most of the cities and state transport undertakings, which are the operators of public buses in Indian cities. And to make the situation even worse with, buses not increasing, ridership decreasing over the decades. On the other hand, private motor vehicle ownership has been on a very steep increase in Indian cities, leading to a stark increase in pollution as well. According to a recent study which was conducted by ICCT, India, among all of the countries in the world, ran second in the number of deaths attributable to transportation emissions itself, which was around 74,000 premature deaths just because of transportation emissions itself. So all of this combined actually nudged the national government itself to set targets for moving towards a cleaner and a greener future as well. And to make that happen, they adopted a National Electric Mobility Mission Plan, NEMMP, for the year 2020. And as part of that plan itself, the Department of Heavy Industries, again, another ministry established at the national level in India, introduced the FAME scheme, FAME standing for the faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicles in India. Now, this scheme was introduced in 2015 to subsidize buses and other modes of transportation to help them shift towards electrification. Now, what has been the experience so far through the schemes? So under the FAME scheme, which, as I said, started in 2015, the main purchase model that they actually supported both of the models, which is outright purchase, where state transport undertaking purchases the buses themselves and then operates it, versus a gross cost contract model where a private operator operates the buses on a fixed per kilometer cost for the state transport undertaking, again, the operators who operate the public buses. So the dominant model under FAME scheme was an outright purchase model, and they were giving subsidies of around 60% to 35% based on the localization which was happening in the Indian cities. Again, this was set up as a part of an initiative to promote manufacturing of vehicles as well in India. And hence the incentive was itself tied to the localization which was happening. Now, interestingly, what the ministry did before they launched the scheme was they actually did a pilot in one of the states in India, in Himachal Pradesh, because there were absolutely no guidelines so far related to electric buses. They did a pilot to understand the kind of operations and the kind of ranges which electric buses can achieve. And they actually used the learnings from this pilot to benchmark the indicative price of a 12-meter and a 9-meter electric bus, which then became part of the FAME scheme itself. And it was through this pilot that India's first electric fleet of around 25 electric buses, all 9-meter buses, was piloted in Himachal Pradesh. Now, after the FAME 1 scheme was rolled out, several cities like Hyderabad here, I'm taking a case study of that, were able to operate these buses. And Hyderabad in this case was operating on a very large range of around 350 to 450 kilometers per day. And how they were actually able to achieve it was using some top-up charges as well, so that they could support this range. Broadly, they were only able to operate around 250 kilometers in a single charge. So the additional kilometer requirement they had, they were able to do that using quick top-ups in between schedules. Now, throughout FAME 1, what happened was that the tender conditions varied across cities, depending on several variations of a 9-meter to 12-meter bus, AC to non-AC variant, and also the assured kilometers per day that these buses would operate as well, varied somewhere from 150 kilometers to even as high as 250 kilometers as well. So because of this, a lot of the cities received very different rates on their electric buses as well. And since in this model, most of them were outright purchase models, only about 10 cities were actually able to use that funding to deploy around 425 electric buses. And a large majority of the funding itself was not utilized because, again, because of the bad financial health of the state transport undertakings. So taking the learnings from FAME 1 scheme, they introduced FAME 2 scheme as well in 2019, where they now promoted only the gross cost contracting model, because a lot of the cities were not able to utilize the funding under FAME 1 due to lack of funds. So they went ahead with a gross cost model in FAME 2 scheme. And this time the funding was also tied to the kilowatt hour of the battery itself, the battery capacity. And the focus also changed in this scheme towards more promotion of electrification of public and shared modes of transportation, and a higher number of buses, which is around 7,090 e-buses, with a total of around 450 million USD were sanctioned under the scheme. As I already said, it was the gross cost model which was introduced this time, and that was the only model which the cities could take up. And along with this, they actually also asked the cities to adopt progressive electric vehicle policies as well, and that became sort of a mandatory condition for them to get the funding or to get selected for getting the buses as well. So that also promoted a lot of states to adopt progressive electric vehicle policies moving ahead in order to get the funding. So that was another good thing which came out as a side product of the scheme itself, apart from the procurement of buses. So what happened under FAME 2 scheme, taking example of Mumbai and Delhi here, again, after they actually got the sanction or approval of the number of buses, there are multiple problems which came up in terms of experience of actually deploying them on ground. So Mumbai in this case was able to get 386 electric buses, but actually Mumbai being a very compact city, the problem that they were struggling with was the lack of land space for the depots itself. Because unlike ICE buses, you need a larger space for setting up the charging units for electric buses. So that was something that they were really struggling with. And what they did for that was they designed some compact distribution transformers, which take up 75% less space than the normal transformers itself, to save on space. So those kind of innovations were something that the city started experimenting with once they had the funding that they needed to get the buses. Similarly, in Delhi as well, what they were able to do, one of the major problems that they had was the power requirement for the number of buses that they wanted. So Delhi wanted to procure around 1,000 electric buses at that point of time, and was able to procure 300 under phase 2 of the FAME scheme itself. So to tackle the problem of this power supply, what they are doing is they are prioritizing depots close to the existing substations itself, because the cost of extending the lines from the substation to the depot is very high. And to reduce on that cost, they are actually doing this kind of planning decision where they are highlighting the depots, or taking up the depots which are closer to the substation first, and then doing the pilots there. And then based on the learnings from these pilots, they can expand. Now, so far, under the FAME 2 scheme, cities have been able to procure around, or tender at least around 2,900 electric buses, which is again a very big win, because before the FAME scheme, none of the cities were thinking about even procuring electric buses. And it has only been through the subsidies provided by the national government under this scheme that this kind of initiatives have happened. And now, because of COVID as well, over the last 2 years, there were a lot of delays in procurement of buses and also delivery of buses by the operators. So they are now extending the FAME scheme till 2024. Another learning which came out of the FAME 2 scheme was that a lot of GCC tenders were getting cancelled. That was because unlike FAME 1 scheme where low rates were quoted, the operators actually got to know the kind of risks that were being put on them, because they had to maintain the electric buses. The cost of electricity was also being put on them. So under FAME 2, a lot of tenders were being cancelled, largely because of the operators quoting very high rates for operating those buses under GCC contracts. Now, again, to rectify that situation, central government learned from that, and through an agency called Convergence Energy Service Limited, which is CESL, they actually aggregated the demand of e-buses under 5 cities through a grand challenge. So under what they did was they combined the demand of 5,580 buses and rolled out a single tender to seek for the prices for operation of these buses in 5 cities. Now, what happened because of it was that because it was a large tender, economies of scale came into effect, and most of the bids that they received were actually less than 50 rupees itself, which was actually very less compared to what was happening under FAME 1 and FAME 2 scheme. So this really helped in this aggregation model, was actually world's largest tender of electric buses itself, really helped in bringing the cost down for the cities. So this is something which is still ongoing. Tata Motors recently won the tender as well for these 5,000 buses as well. Now, this has been the story of how cities were able to procure buses under the, mostly under the FAME 1 and FAME 2 scheme. We saw a lot of action happening under that as well, large number of buses getting procured. But there were a few cities and states which were actually able to procure buses on their own financing as well. So taking a case study of Pune, Pune was actually one of the initial cities which was able to operate electric buses, and is one of the cities with the largest fleet of buses on ground in India as well. They are operating around 150 electric buses on their BRT corridors, 9 meter and 12 meters. And how Pune was able to get this was through another national ministry scheme called the Smart Cities Mission Scheme. So under that, they were able to get the subsidies of around rupees 50 lakhs per bus, or 65,000 USD, which was given to the operator. Again, this was under GCC model that they went ahead with for a 10-year contract for operating these buses. Now, in Tamil Nadu, on the other hand, what the government did was they had a look at, they wanted to procure buses across the state for all of the cities. So they took support of KfW, a German state-owned bank, to procure around 2,000 electric buses. And they received a funding of 1,600 crores, which is closer to around 200 million USD. And that's how the Tamil Nadu government was able to get a large number of electric buses. The actual funding is actually for BS6 buses as well. They are procuring around 21,000 BS6 buses, and 2,000 of them are the electric ones. So under the phase 1 itself, they are getting 500 buses by the end of this year or early next year. And while these buses are again outright purchase, for the remaining buses, Tamil Nadu is exploring the possibility of operating them under a gross cost contract as well. So FAME 2 really opened the way for embracing a gross cost contract for most of the cities across the country, and really sparked the way of moving towards electrification. So if I have to, really summarize of what the journey has been and what has happened in Indian cities, FAME 2 scheme, FAME 1 and FAME 2 schemes have been the primary drivers of electric bus procurement in India. Schemes like this, especially when they come from the national government, when a lot of the state transport undertakings are cash crushed, it really helps them, and they are skeptical about a new technology as well. The cost of electric buses in India was almost twice as that of a CNG or a diesel bus. So a scheme like this has really helped in accelerating the adoption of the scheme. But moving ahead, so right now there are around 30,000 buses in India, total buses, ICE buses. Around 1,000 of them are electric buses, but the requirement is around 150,000 buses that are required across the country. So this is just the beginning of the journey for moving towards electrification. A lot of states actually need to move towards, like Tamil Nadu, identify their own sources of sustaining and providing funding for services and running of these electric buses as well. And along with that, we also observed over the last couple of years, when these cities have been running the pilots, that most state transport undertakings also lack the capacity to plan and operate these electric buses. So moving ahead, it's also extremely important for these states to also invest in peer-to-peer learning and capacity development program as well for effective operation and maintenance of electric buses, because different cities had shared these different case studies. They're all struggling with very different kind of problems, and these peer-to-peer learning can really help the cities in learning as much as they can from the experience of other cities, and especially capacity development is required for operating these buses once they are procured. Back to you, Ivona.
Great, thank you so much, Vaishali. Great, you can stop sharing your screen. Amazing. And I'll invite Faela to take the floor.
Thank you, Ivona. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Faela. Now we want to present the lesson learned from our study regarding the MicroTrans electrifications for Transjakarta. Yeah, before we start on the electrifications of MicroTrans, I want to share the overview of Transjakarta services. So Transjakarta is I think it's the largest BRT system in the world. So currently it has 13 corridor with 250 kilometers network, and it covers 82% of population in Jakarta. And in February 2020, so it reached the highest number of passengers, which is 1 million passengers. Next. And then Transjakarta currently operate around 3,500, more than 3,500 fleets. That has a variety ranging from 18-meter articulated buses operated on the BRT services to 4-meter fleets running on microbus routes we call MicroTrans, that we will discuss further regarding the electrification of MicroTrans. And now they operate around 153 routes, and MicroTrans route itself is accounted 70 routes, which is 45% of overall Transjakarta's number of routes. And for the electrification plan, it is stated on the Transjakarta long-term plan that they plan to electrify 10,000 their fleets by 2030. And then in 2025, they also commit to stop to procure the diesel buses. And the current progress, so hopefully at the end of this year, in 2022, they'll operate 74 units of low entry e-buses, or maybe will be reached around 100 e-buses. Next. And the current progress, so currently 30 low floor e-buses has been running in a pilot basis actually, and it will scale up to 70 to 100 buses at the end of this year. It's around 200 kilometers, and then it's daily and with overnight charging facilities. So now why electrifying or integrating MicroTrans into Transjakarta system is very important. First, I want to share regarding MicroTrans Journey to integrate into Transjakarta system. So before, the MicroTrans is semi-regulated paratransit with low performance and also reliability. And under the bigger scheme, which is Jaklingko scheme, Jaklingko is the integrated transportation scheme in Transjakarta, in Jakarta. So it's going to be integration of ticketing, operation, and then physical integration as well. One of it is to integrate all of road-based system, including MicroTrans, into Transjakarta system. So all of road-based system should be integrated into Transjakarta to improve level of service. So so MicroTrans or microbus cooperative should have like a contract with Transjakarta with ghost cost contract, and then the operator of course will be paid by cost per kilometer, and to comply with the level of, they should also comply with the service level agreement that Transjakarta already set. And then currently they done the fleet renewal, even though it's still diesel basis. So they renew diesel micro bus fleets with the real-time visual information and also air conditions. And in the future, hopefully next year, Transjakarta plan to start to electrify the MicroTrans. And what is the integration of MicroTrans Impact for Transjakarta for the whole system? Actually, by integrating MicroTrans, it bring a huge impact for Transjakarta. It improve services and also it widen the coverage, the network coverage of Transjakarta into 96%. Before in 2070s, the coverage is only 42%, and then now they plan to have coverage of 95% in 2022. And then it's also widen the number of routes as well. Before in 2017, it only has 122 routes, and now Transjakarta operates around 250 routes. And of course, daily passengers, it increased 100%. In February, as I mentioned earlier, Transjakarta's daily passenger reached the highest number of passengers. It's 1 million daily passenger. And it just happened only in 3 years. Of course, it has also high impact for passengers, so it improved passenger travel experience. And because MicroTrans passengers mostly is from low income and also women. So it has like free tariff, so it reduced transportation expenses as well. The next is why the electrification of MicroTrans is very important for the whole scale up of Transjakarta electrifications. Because in the future plan in 2030, MicroTrans will be accounted around 32% of overall Transjakarta e-bus fleets. So it will have highest impact among other fleets type. So it can be momentous to scale up Transjakarta electric buses. And then it will has like 70 routes. So the coverage of the electric MicroTrans will be higher, and then it's also cheaper if we calculate compared to diesel buses in 5 years. Its cost per kilometer is 21% cheaper, and of course it will have a higher impact on the GHG reduction. It will give 70% impact on GHG reductions. However, actually MicroTrans has a unique operational characteristics. So the transformation is actually gradual. So currently, most of them still don't have a depot. So if we want to electrify them, there will be very difficult to install charging infrastructure for overnight charging. So they also don't have off-peak operational split like unlike other Transjakarta services. But the other operational characteristic that we can utilize for the electrification purposes is they have a longer dwelling time at the terminus. So this event could be used as for charge the battery during the terminus. When they finish their journey. Because of there is no depot, we consider that terminus locations and also empty land near the terminus point could be utilized as a depot or charging infrastructure locations. So for our study that we analyzed around the MicroTrans network, we identify that there are 60 terminus points. So MicroTrans then could take advantage of longer dwelling time duration at the terminus for charging purposes. And I would like also to share our findings on how to develop a roadmap for MicroTrans electrifications. So there is several things that need to be considered for developing the roadmap. First is the electrification target and also expansion plans from Transjakarta itself and also the city government, the provincial government of Jakarta. And then we have to also comply with phase-out plan of diesel buses based on the age of the fleet. And then business model and also funding model, because the MicroTrans operators usually have the limited funding capacity. And then also charging policy is very important. And the implementation phasing development is also need to be considered. So we need to identify key supporting policy needed And then we need to have a strategy for charging and understand on the market for battery and charging technology, charging infrastructure, mainly on the charging infrastructure locations, and then number of e-bus that need to be procured, and also we need to understand the routes that we need to select for the first phase of the implementations. This is our funding. So we have developed 4 phase and then 1 pilot phases based on the policy, and then e-bus or e-microtrans to be procured, and then charging infrastructure characteristics, charging strategy, and battery and charging technology, and also the route characteristic selections. And there's also important milestone on its implementation phase that we need to be achieved to ensure the success of MicroTrans electrifications, mainly for the pilot phase, because we need to create a quick demonstration value. And then the milestone that we need to achieve on phase 1 is how we define the subsidy, incentive, and persuasions help to reach a tipping point. And for the second phase, technology has been established. So business model hopefully are in place as well for the large scale of implementations. And for phase 3, we need to, after the technology established, so there is ability to try new technology and business model towards the larger scale of the implementations. And the last phase is phase 4, deployment hopefully has reached on a stable phase. Since unlike the other e-buses, because MicroTrans Electric, there is not a lot of benchmark for MicroTrans electrification. So the pilot phase for MicroTrans electrification is very crucial. That is why there is several things that we need to consider. First is evaluate the technical specification. Second is we need to involve all of the stakeholders. So conversation with microbus manufacturer and operators, and then OEMs on running the pilot phase and collect the data and performance. And also on the route selections, we need to identify the characteristic of the routes. And we need to also perform duty cycle analysis and evaluate the funding before we can move toward the full deployment. Next is there is a lesson learned from and funding from our studies. So mainly in Jakarta and also Indonesia, there is still segregated vision and actions between a national government and also local government. And then there's also still lack of supporting local policy for large scale deployment. And then for MicroTrans, higher complexity and social issue and electrifying the MicroTrans, mainly is because most of them is still individually owned, and then the MicroTrans operators have low capital capacity. And then the current Transjakarta business model and financing scheme cannot cope with the electrification target, since the private operator need greater financial capacity and still limited knowledge about know-how on electric buses, and the absence of public charging infrastructure. And the most important thing is the current MicroTrans fleets fuel is still, the government still gives subsidy for that. So the TCO won't be like higher because of the government still gives subsidy to the MicroTrans current fuels. Yeah, I think that's all from me. We can continue on the discussion. Over to you, Ivona. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Faela, and all presenters for those rich presentations and insights. So at this point, I would like to invite Stan back to moderate the short discussion. And if time allows, we'll also pick a few questions from the Q&A at the end. So over to you, Stan.
Thank you, Ivona. I think both presentations are really interesting, and I think covering Asia, the region has a diverse kind of array of different approaches that are being kind of taken, and specifically even looking at different modes. I think what would be really interesting to kind of maybe just tap into or explore a little bit deeper is from your respective regions, what are the challenges I think that you all have experienced or seen for scaling up, and maybe I'll tie this with the second question. And I guess, what advice would you give to cities as they consider, developing their own roadmaps about, this implementation process? And I guess maybe we can start with Vaishali.
Sure. I think two challenges which are there, which I also highlighted in the presentation as well. One is that while it's good that the national government has sparked this move towards electrification, there is more that needs to be done at the state level, given the quantum of buses that need to be procured and run in these states and the quantum of gap which is currently there. I think the state really needs to create the plan to start investing towards public transportation and provide subsidies, especially if we are looking at transitioning towards a more clean and green fuel buses. So that is one. I think, again, the scale up would, of course, these national schemes help, but the actual scale up can only happen when it's the states itself which are funding their own buses and helping the cities out in expanding. I think second more important thing is that right now in India, we are in a stage where a lot of cities have done different kind of pilots. So it's very important for them to actually share their learnings with each other. We have had different kind of problems in different cities and different kind of in climatic conditions as well. And the performance of electric buses have been changing according to it. So important for them to come together, share their learnings, and again, for the state to look into some capacity development programs. Because while more and more buses are coming in, they also need to now operate them effectively to deploy them on the routes which are most effective. So those would be the two key takeaways that cities and states can focus on going ahead for scale up.
That's great. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Faela, do you have a specific?
Yeah, so unlike India, unfortunately, we haven't have any FAME 1, FAME 2, and FAME 3. For public transport, so Transjakarta will be a model for other Indonesian cities. And unfortunately, there is no support, like limited support, if we may say, from the government. And then for the scale up, I think the most difficult is that Transjakarta and also bus operator face currently is financing, because they need to procure the bus, which is a lot higher, more expensive, and they also need to provide charging infrastructure. So they used to fueling the gas at the gas station. Now they need to also provide the charging infrastructure for overnight charging. So yeah, the charging infrastructures cost, and also the electric bus cost itself is the higher of that is like really challenging currently. And innovative business model invite like other stakeholders to also involve on this program. I think that will be important, and hopefully in the future we will have a similar approach like in India. Hopefully our government will see this. FAME, I think that will be helpful because Jakarta is always been again model for others. I think helping Transjakarta to quickly roll out its electrifications of its fleet, I think it will be help other cities as well, maybe in other cities in Indonesia and also Southeast Asia.
Yeah, obviously great national policies would be amazing, like the FAME program. But I think the example of Pune and Tamil Nadu, and of course, obviously places like Jakarta are great examples of cities taking it upon themselves to kind of really take those next steps. I think part of this is, and specifically, I think around the microbus, it's like dilemma of sorts. I guess my question then for you, maybe Faila, is what. I guess in terms of, I think you maybe mentioned this, but it would maybe be a little more clarity on this, would be without having the depots, how would the microbuses kind of operate, I guess, with that issue of charging, and what type of accommodations would be necessary?
So we take the benefit of longer dwelling time, and we identify there is usually a space on the terminus at the end of the route. Of the operations, they usually like a parking or a terminus locations that can be identified as a charging infrastructure locations. And based on our study, we develop like a typology. For example, if there are wider space, we can provide overnight charging there. But if only like a small space available, we can install opportunity charging.
Interesting. That's and Vaishali, I think you mentioned a number of the challenges. Are there other strategies being kind of implemented in conjunction with the electrification? And maybe you could speak a little bit more about those other kind of considerations that these challenges are trying to tackle as well.
Oh, sure. So, like other than the FAME scheme, there are examples like Pune and Tamil Nadu, but overall throughout the country, there has been a lot of push towards moving towards clean and green fuels, including electrification. So there have been supporting policies as well, which are actually supporting states in thinking more seriously towards electrification. And globally as well, India has set targets to move towards zero emission by 2050. So that itself sets the precedence for a lot of cities and states to move towards a completely zero emission fleet. And as I said, before even the FAME scheme came in, especially the FAME 2 scheme, there were strict emission mandates also, which were adopted by the government, especially for buses. So all of them are together providing a full ecosystem for cities to transition towards electrification and greener fuels.
No, that's great. And again, I think obviously there's a long way to go, but I think best cities kind of taking these necessary steps and learning from them. This is a really good opportunity to kind of build and improve upon those things. I think I'm going to turn it over to Ivona to see if there are any specific questions from the audience that for our panelists.
Sure. I'll try to squeeze in 2 questions. So one is continuing the conversation on batteries. So Kitano is asking about recycling the electric bus batteries. And on the other hand, Suvarna is asking about dealing with unused and defunct batteries. So you have 2 sides of the coin and how to do it, as I guess, sustainably. Paola?
First is on the recycling battery. Actually, honestly, for Indonesia, we haven't, there is the electrification rollout is not that much. So we haven't have any issues on the battery recycling. However, I think, yeah, we actually, like what we learn from other countries, we can use battery to use for others, for example, like or remodify that. But regarding the electric, but we have included the recycling battery on the. We have a regulation under the presidential regulation on that, but for the implementation, we haven't have any plan on that. But maybe, yeah, in the future, we can utilize that for other purposes.
And I'll just jump in really quickly as well. And I said, yeah, no, that's a great answer, Faila, because I think a lot of places are still in the very early and nascent kind of parts of this this process. So I think it's an important question to be asking now in preparation for what happens to these batteries, following their usage, and given what we know, that's I think up to 6 years, you might start experiencing this turnover. So if cities aren't planning for it, they should be going forward. And I think this is something that, everyone can kind of take a lesson from. And other countries are a little maybe further ahead. And so maybe looking at those as examples to kind of understand what are some of the complexities and how they're managing this is going to be very important.
Yeah. Even in India as well, there isn't a particular policy which looks into battery replacement or management right now, because it's a very new thing. Cities are still experimenting with electrification. But what the national government has prepared is actually a draft battery waste management rule. It just came out in 2020. It's out there for public consultation, at least it was some time back. So it's still in a draft stage, but what it's proposing is putting the onus of recycling of batteries on the operators and the manufacturers themselves when they're getting new batteries. That's where they have to make sure that the previous ones are still disposed, but it's still in a draft stage. It has not been officially adopted yet.
Great, thank you. And we have time for one more question. This one is related to this questions from Emmanuel. It's about supporting policies that can help create better experiences for the passengers. So are there any policies that emerge because of this electrification push with regards to the vehicle standards, for example, air conditioning, or maybe policies that support safety within the public transport? So are there any examples of policies like that?
Maybe I can help. So in our study, we always mainstream the GESI issue, gender equality, social inclusion issues. So we want to make sure that, for example, like people with hearing disabilities, because the electric buses won't make like so much noises, that so it also safe for them. And then the transformation as well into the electric buses should be also equal. Like, for example, like whether the training between a man driver and women drivers, because the driver comfortability, I think that's very important on this transformation. Driver experience that will have impact on the also passenger experience, because it's a new thing for the driver. So training, I guess, for not only men, that has to be, because in Transjakarta itself we also have a woman drivers, that also to be in place. And another thing is maybe campaign for the passengers that they are riding more environmental friendly modes. So they will contribute less GHG emissions, something like that. I think that could be done to promote the deployment of electric buses.
Great, thank you. Vaishali, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so in India, nothing particularly relating to that, but along with the FAME policies, so buses were still a regulated sector where the bus specifications were there. But what really helped with these FAME policies was that they actually came up with specifications for three-wheelers as well for electric. So that has been one area where a lot of accidents were happening because of them just moving towards lithium-ion lead acid batteries without really going through the entire process of converting it fully. So they became quite unsafe. So through the policy, they did mention a lot of specification for these vehicles, and it has been quite useful. Not per se in the bus case, because there were mandates which were already around for that. But I think three-wheelers have especially benefited from that.
Great, thank you. So we are past the time. I just wanted to say huge thank you to the full panel, but also our attendees for joining this event. I encourage you all to be on the lookout for upcoming events, and one such is on June 8th. It will be a session with the city of Peshawar, which is a part of the annual programming with ITDP Sustainable Transport Award, honorable mention and recipient cities. So in this session, we'll also focus on in great detail on bus systems, mainly deployment of Peshawar's gold standard BRT and hybrid electric buses. So the sign up link is in the chat. And with that, again, thank you so much, Faela, Vaishali, and Stan for this wonderful session. And I hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Take care.